Once that chemotherapy stopped, the cancer spread quite rapidly to the point where she ended up with tumours, obviously in her bowel, in her liver, spine, brain, lymph nodes, everywhere. And by the time that somebody realised that the cancer had spread so significantly, there was nothing more that can be done about it. And strangely enough, this is exactly the 1-year anniversary of when we were told that there was nothing more that could be done, and she had 2 to 4 weeks to live.
Hello, and welcome to Sketch Notes on a Pandemic. I'm Lucy Johnston, health editor of the Sunday Express. If you're interested in these conversations, please like and subscribe to Sketch Notes on a Pandemic. We'll have many more great guests coming soon. Today, we're going to be speaking to Craig Russell, founder of the Catch Up with Cancer campaign, whose 31-year-old daughter died in June 2020 after being refused cancer treatment 12 weeks earlier due to lockdown restrictions. Kelly Smith, a beauty therapist and single mother, leaves behind a 7-year-old son, Finn. Craig, who has met Matt Hancock, is working with charities and powerful parliamentary groups to raise the profile of what he believes is a huge and emerging crisis that he says the government has failed to acknowledge. I wonder if you could just talk us through that and why you started the campaign.
Hi, Lucy. Yes, of course. So Kelly was diagnosed with stage 4 bowel cancer back in 2017. And over the following years, she'd been through a couple of major surgeries, chemotherapy, radiotherapy, clinical trials, everything you could think of. Because obviously at stage 4, there wasn't really an option of a cure, but all these various treatments she was going through were life prolonging. So she was on her 4th round of chemotherapy in January last year. And towards the end of March, she went into the hospital as usual. The process was always to get her bloods checked before chemotherapy, which they did. And just as she was expecting to start chemo, she was told that they weren't going to do it for this cycle, and that because of the risk of COVID, they recommended that Kelly went home and self-isolated for 12 weeks. So that she duly did, although she was quite angry and quite upset about that, because, like I said, the chemotherapy wasn't a cure, but what it was doing is it was slowing down the progression of the cancer. Once that chemotherapy stopped, the cancer spread quite rapidly to the point where she ended up with tumours, obviously in her bowel, in her liver, spine, brain, lymph nodes, everywhere. And by the time that somebody realised that the cancer had spread so significantly, there was nothing more that can be done about it. And strangely enough, this is exactly the 1-year anniversary of when we were told that there was nothing more that could be done, and she had 2 to 4 weeks to live.
So tell me I know Kelly has a 7-year-old daughter. He was Finn, 6 at the time. So in March 2020, she was told to go home and self-isolate. Why do you think that was unnecessary? I mean, had you previously been managing her immunocompromised position with, she's presumably, all infections could, you'd had to manage her condition with all infections. What do you think that was an unnecessary thing to do?
Yes, fundamentally, yes. There was always the risk of catching COVID, and let's face it, hospitals, I wouldn't say they were a hotspot, but there were obviously plenty of people being admitted there, so there was an elevated risk of her catching COVID. But I would always weigh up the fact that she may have caught COVID against the fact she has cancer. So, and that was how Kelly thought as well. It was very much a question of, why aren't we treating what I have now that will kill me against worrying about something I might never even catch? And whilst I understand that COVID for Kelly in her immunosuppressed state could have been potentially fatal, then in some respects that was a chance worth taking, because the cancer we knew would be fatal.
And you, now running the campaign, have heard of other people who've had similar stories. I mean, you've had quite a number of people who've come forward. Is that right?
Sadly, Lucy, this situation that we had with Kelly is far from an isolated occurrence. We've been contacted by a tragically large number of people who have been through very similar circumstances. For example, 1 week, I think October last year, I just put a post out and said, if anybody's had a similar experience, please let me know. And I think we got 52 responses.
My goodness.
Just from one post, which was out to a relatively small number of people. And since then, we have heard this happening time and time again.
Was there a right to choose? I mean, should they have been given a right to choose? Could she not have said, look, I'd rather take the risk of developing coronavirus against the risk of my not having this treatment? Was that not an option?
I think it should have been, yeah, for
and
sure.
It wasn't. It wasn't given to her as a choice. I suppose you listened to the clinician.
No, it was pretty much, that's what you need to do. And, with hindsight, maybe Kelly could have gone back and challenged it more, but she decided to go down a different route, which was to seek a second opinion. Of course,
too late.
It was too late, and of course there wasn't a doctor in sight that she could realistically go to, so we had to go privately. And I had a consultation with an oncologist on Harley Street. But again, because everything was slowed down because of a lack of resources, even getting things like a blood test done was taking 10 days. And by the time we were actually able to provide all the evidence to this consultant, it was effectively too late for him to do anything about it as well. If we'd been maybe a week earlier, there may have been options.
So during those last days and weeks, it was she? How was she? Was she angry? I mean, how was Finn, and how was he about it? How has the family dealt with it on an emotional level?
Kelly was surprisingly upbeat, but that was just the way she was. All through her cancer battles, she'd always tried to remain as positive as ever.
She's a beautician, wasn't she? Yes, was a beautician.
Oh, yeah. Yes, she was.
And very kind. I remember you saying a very kind and giving person, which is one of the reasons why you feel you want to help people now. But yes, carry on.
So even though, Kelly didn't actually want to know how long she had left. Mandy and I both knew that it was 2 to 4 weeks, but Kelly just didn't really want to acknowledge it. And there were so many things that she'd wanted to do in her life that, because of the prognosis and also because of lockdown, she was never going to get to do them. So we tried to approach the thing as positively as we could, bearing in mind we couldn't actually go anywhere.
But did that not add sort of almost more to the tragedy of her death, in that you could not have, I gather, people at the hospice where she died, you couldn't have visitors, you couldn't have friends. That made it even more sort of, would you say, perhaps some people would call it inhumane. How were those last weeks? How do you remember them?
They were immensely challenging on so many different levels, Lucy. She knew she didn't have long. And of course, she had lots of friends, lots of family. She would have loved to have spent lots of time with everybody. Not so much to say their goodbyes, but, I think it's almost from a point of view of a sort of an emotional closure almost in some respects. And we were able, being very careful, to have a few people come round and sit in the garden, even though technically that was probably against the rules, but quite frankly, under the circumstances, we thought well, what the hell? So she was able to see some of her friends, some family, but by no means could she see everybody she wanted to. So that in itself was stressful, and we were in this really strange dichotomy whereby we couldn't ignore the fact that Kelly didn't have one, but at the same time we were trying to keep as normal a life as possible because that's what she wanted, but also it was important to try and retain that stability for Finn as well.
And just talk a little bit about Finn, if you feel you can. But I know we've spoken before about how you feel he's not quite able to take on the full enormity of what's happened to probably the most important person in his life. She was a single mum, wasn't she? I remember. How does he's had little moments, I remember you saying.
Indeed he has, but there again, I would say we all do when we lose a parent. We only lost my mum in 2019, and even now, my mum was 87. So there's always that point of you losing a parent that leaves a degree of emotional scarring. I think with Finn being 6, he faces a different challenge because you don't necessarily have all those tens of years of history that you look back on that you can pull good points and bad points from. To have a sort of a balanced view on somebody's life. He never had that realistically, 3-4 years of memories with Kelly. So the impact on him in some degree was slightly lessened because you don't have that history. But I think also the emotional impact is potentially greater because, the most important person in his life, because let's face it, even as a dad, I would always admit mum is always the most important person. She's gone. She's not there. And I think he doesn't necessarily know how to process that, what is grief to a 6-year-old. And I think that is very different to all of us. And I think age has a very large bearing on that. So where he is now is, he does ask about Kelly quite frequently. He stayed with us on Sunday night and just asked a little question. So it's very hard to understand how he processes that. We know he is thinking about her because, I say, occasionally he does make comments or ask questions. But, we were slightly reluctant to push him into talking about it too much because, I think it's one of those things that we don't want to push him into a corner where we are making him confront his grief at a point where he's not emotionally ready. But at the same time, if he asks about Kelly, then we're very free and open talking to him about it.
Just one thing I do hear a lot of people say how resilient children are and how they can bounce through anything. But I think that's, what do you think about that?
I think kids are amazingly resilient. But I think at the end of the day, they're still people. They might be young, but they are still people. Perhaps my greatest hope for Finn over the coming years is that he wants to talk about Kelly more as he gets older. Since Kelly died, perhaps not unsurprisingly, he's been to her grave once. I think that's perhaps just something at a 6-year-old or 7 as he is now, isn't something that they really want to do. But there again, who really does want to go and visit, a loved one's grave? So I hope that, it's through sort of keeping an eye on him, supporting him, that, it's more like drawing out a splinter, if you like. It's going to be a drawn out, long process. But we have to make sure we acknowledge the fact that it is something we do need to talk about as a family and support him, at whatever point he needs our support.
And so just moving on now to what you've been doing to try and raise the profile of the collateral damage of COVID to cancer and how that has been received by government, I know you've met Matt Hancock. So shall we just have a chat about what you've achieved and the problems that you've faced, if any, along the way?
Sure. achieved... I guess we have achieved some things, but I'm a naturally impatient person, so perhaps not as much as I would have liked, as quickly as I would have liked, but I guess these things, there is a process. Following Kelly's death, I was asked if I would be interested in being a co-founder on the Catch Up with Cancer campaign. And taking into account that Kelly's sort of wish all throughout her cancer treatment was to help other cancer people, it seemed the only way I could really reconcile of any scrap of good coming out of losing Kelly was to sort of carry on what I thought she would want us to do. So we launched the campaign initially with a petition on change.org, which got some fairly good response and some initial TV work, media work. And we moved sort of fairly quickly from sort of a standing start up to having around about 150,000 signatures after the first week. And there were people who were starting to pay a little bit of attention on what we were talking about, which at that point was, according to research done in June last year, there was 35,000 people at risk because they couldn't get the treatment they needed for cancer. So over that period of time, we continued to challenge the government. The petition grew organically quite nicely. So I think we're around just under 400,000 signatures now. So it has definitely struck a chord with the public. We also have got the attention of some of the chairs for the various APPGs on cancer, who were very early supporters. We've had a few celebrity supporters as well. And all that led to some pressure, I think, on Matt Hancock to meet with us in October, which we duly did. And I have to say that the outcome of that was disappointing, to put it mildly, in that we positioned all our data with Matt Hancock, and we also came up with points in terms of a recovery plan that would help to address the current situation. We had a commitment from him that he would look into what we shared with him, and the output of that was effectively nothing. Absolutely nothing was done.
So the government would argue and frequently tell me when I write about this that they are up to speed with cancer referrals now and the 62-week wait is being met. So what's your response to that?
My response to that is they are probably correct. But unfortunately, it doesn't take a genius statistician to work out that there's a fundamental flaw in the government's argument. If your capacity is, say, for example, to see 10,000 patients a week, and that's what you're seeing, what about the hundreds of thousands of patients who haven't been seen yet? We know that there are a large number of people out there who have not been able to see a GP, have not been able to get a referral. They are still waiting on treatment, surgery, radiotherapy, chemotherapy. How are you going to deal with that backlog if your capacity does not increase? So there's a massive fundamental flaw in the government argument. They say that we're now up to speed, like that's a good thing. It is, but not if you're in the backlog, because as things stand, with the capacity that the government have put in place with the NHS, then the only way the backlog reduces is by people dying. And for me, that is grossly unacceptable if there is something that can be done to help these people. They have a right to life just as much as anybody else.
So with the collateral, with those cancer patients waiting, I know you've got figures, haven't you, where you've gathered work which has been done by the Lancet and elsewhere. And I think, is it 40,000 patients who are awaiting treatment or haven't started treatment compared to last year? And I mean, what are the figures that you have got? What is the backlog? Because it presumably includes people who haven't been diagnosed and are walking around with cancer they don't know about because they haven't been screened, and also people that have not been able to get to screening.
The figures, Lucy, are fairly shocking, whichever ones you look at. So one of the most recent figures, which was Cancer Research UK, they've estimated that there's over 43,000 people currently walking around in the UK with cancer, and they don't even know they've got it. Now, I think that is because patients are still finding it incredibly difficult to see a GP face-to-face. Too often we're hearing of somebody trying to get in touch with a GP and they get a telephone consultation or maybe a Zoom meeting. I cannot, for the life of me, understand how you can do a diagnosis on that basis.
No, I've
But
had one of those myself. So the 40,000 people who are walking around with cancer that don't know it is compared to last year. It's not just like any old year people can be doing that. That is the estimates
correct.
of pandemic policy on cancer. Yeah, just to make that very clear. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we also know that there are, to quantify, we know there are in excess of 2 million people who have also missed routine screenings. Now, the whole point of obviously routine screenings is to catch cancer early, whatever that might be screened for. Now, without that routine screening, it means that people are not going to get diagnosed early. So the prognosis for them, if cancer is caught late, is sadly, inevitably, that usually is not a good diagnosis. And quite often there is nothing to be done from a clinical point of view for somebody at that point. And again, this is all that is avoidable, but quite how we're going to catch up with all these missed screenings, with the lack of referrals, how are we going to catch up with that with the capacity we have now? It just does not work. And I cannot, for the life of me, understand the government's position that, first of all, there is no crisis, and secondly, it'll be all right. That is, to me, absolutely burying your head in the sand. I mean, this cancer crisis is here. This isn't just me. This isn't just catch up with cancer. This is something that's also supported by all the cancer charities. It's supported by hundreds of MPs. It's supported by the APPGs, by oncologists. So quite why the government's response is, we're not going to even acknowledge this as a problem. It's criminal to me. It's absolutely criminal.
How have they said that they're not acknowledging it's a problem? I mean, they have said they've put money into new radiotherapy treatments. They have, worked hard, they would say, to bring the target waiting lists up to capacity, up to speed again. What else can be done? What should they do? And, have you had response to say that, enough is being done? The budget didn't have any extra money for cancer, did it? And various other things. Yeah. So how has that been demonstrated by them?
Well, I think, as ever, Lucy, the devil is in the detail. The government, as you mentioned, said, we've provisioned 300 million at the spending review for new radiotherapy equipment. What that actually meant is they were spending 300 million replacing currently expired radiotherapy equipment. So they weren't actually giving us new capacity, just new machines. Now, it's typically how the government is spinning a lot of this, is to say, we are doing this without actually quantifying what that means. At the last budget, they're giving a 1 billion towards the elective backlog. That could cover everything from major cancer surgery to dealing with somebody with an ingrowing toenail. And let's face it, with the backlog in all areas of the NHS, 1 billion is frankly not even going to probably cover the administrative costs, let alone deal with all the patients who need this. So we have been to the government time and time again. We have said this to them time and time again, that if you want to deal with a backlog like this, you need a plan. And there isn't one. Restoring services to how they were before, that's not the answer. And let's face it, pre-COVID, cancer services in the UK were not great in terms of comparisons with the rest of Europe. So not only are we fighting an uphill battle, we're doing it with one arm tied behind our back, comparatively speaking. There needs to be a plan. I think the second thing is there needs to be somebody in charge of this at a ministerial level responsible for delivering it. Now, the government might say there are already people in place that will do that. Well, what I would say is look at the vaccine rollout. A minister for vaccines was appointed. They were given the correct funding and the workforce and the will behind that to succeed, and it has gone extremely well. There's your part of your template of how you need to do this. You need a minister in charge with a clear plan. It has to be financed, because without that, where's extra capacity going to come from? Because we need additional workforce. And I acknowledge the fact that you can't just bring in specialist nurse and oncologists at the click of your fingers. It takes time. But just because it's going to take time and effort doesn't mean you shouldn't at least try. There also needs to be improvement in diagnostic equipment because, as we mentioned before, you catch cancer earlier, you improve a patient's chances of survival much, much quicker. There needs to be an investment in basically IT infrastructure. Might sound like a boring topic, but at the moment, we've got so many NHS trusts that are effectively siloed and don't talk to each other that you might live in an area where that trust doesn't have capacity to see you for a month. Whereas 10 miles down the road, another trust might be able to see you tomorrow, but you'll never know that. So if we can get the systems talking together, we can make the full use of the capacity within the NHS.
Carry on, please.
I was just saying the last thing as well is, we need an investment in equipment. Replacing out-of-date radiotherapy machines, great, but we need to increase that capacity. Radiotherapy can be used very quickly, very safely to treat patients. So we should be focusing on that and also looking at things like dedicated oncology suites where patients can get chemotherapy in a safe environment. So it needs a multi-pronged approach to this if we're going to deal with this backlog, this crisis that doesn't exist.
So this group of people that you have the support of, hundreds of MPs, and I've seen them, such as your frustration, you're now calling for evidence and about to launch a mega summit, aren't you, I gather, in May,
Indeed.
because the government has not acted on what you see is a crisis right now. So talk to me about what you're trying to do, which I think the call for evidence is out there this week, isn't it? So
Indeed, it
is in May. Yeah, tell me.
Yeah, so and this is certainly something that's been led by three of the key APPGs for cancer radiotherapy and for health.
So the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Cancer, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Radiotherapy, and the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Health. Right, so powerful government parliamentary bodies, they're all leading the charge here. And you've got who else on board?
Well, we've already reached out to leading cancer charities, cancer research groups, leading oncologists, asking them to basically submit their data. I think, as I've mentioned before, my impression is the government thinks that the Catch Up with Cancer campaign are a bunch of quacks, or a bunch of scaremongers without any real credibility.
Do you think
yeah, I absolutely believe that.
No, but do you believe that they are either blind to what you see as a crisis, or do you think they are just burying their head? Are they burying their head in the sand, or are they being deceitful?
I'll go with the burying your head in the sand option, I think, Lucy, because they ignore the evidence that is put in front of them time and time again. There may be other motives behind that, but I don't want to speculate on that. I will just deal with what I see.
Other countries, did they manage better than us? I mean, everyone sort of within Europe has faced a pandemic. Have they had the same problems with cancer, or don't you really know?
Well, I do know because I do have friends and colleagues work in countries all over the world. And whilst it's not a very scientific approach, I know certainly a lot of countries have been able to maintain cancer services throughout. One country in particular I do know of is Australia. And Australia had hit them just as hard as the UK from a pandemic point of view, but they were able to maintain services. True, they had to put safeguards in place. So people going for appointments, radiotherapy, chemotherapy had to do it alone, which is not ideal, but at least they were still being seen and treated. So I think the whole message that we've had for the last 12 months, about staying at home, save lives, it was perhaps a bit too literal, because COVID wasn't the only thing out there that was killing people. And even now we are getting to, hopefully, the very tail end of the pandemic. There are still other things out there killing people. The people we've lost from COVID, it's tragic, to lose that many people. But let's not also forget that in the same period of time, at least 168,000 people have died of cancer. So quite why we would ignore cancer, which is statistically a bigger killer, I have no idea. It just seems that the people are being thrown under the bus because the focus has been on one thing and one thing only in a very blinkered approach.
And we don't know at this stage how many projected deaths there may be from our response to the pandemic. There have been various estimates. I don't know whether you have any of cancer death.
Yeah, I mean, no one has really done, as far as I'm aware, any research in terms of how many people are expected to die since the initial research was done in June last year. I mean, I think at that point to say this figure could be 35,000 was probably shocking enough as it was back then. But, although towards the end of last year, things started to get close to normal, then of course in the end of December, we walked straight into a 3-month lockdown. So things have not improved at all. So I think it's safe to say that if you weighed up everything in terms of what we've already done from a research point of view, what we've been told around getting GP appointments, referrals, missed scans, we are certainly looking at tens of thousands of people who will lose their lives to cancer. But most importantly, of course, this is avoidable. This isn't inevitable, it's avoidable.
And so you won't give up. It looks like you're going to carry on with this no matter what, just keep helping people. And presumably you help people at a personal level who come get in touch with you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, myself and Mandy, we do get messages from quite a lot of people. And sometimes it's just people asking for practical support. They will say, I've been trying to get to see my GP and I can't, or I've been told that my cancer treatment or my surgery is going to be delayed for 6 weeks, 6 months. I'm terrified. What should I do? So, we are learning as we go about what the options are for patients. And, wherever we can, we try to help them. Sadly, we can't wave a magic wand, but at least we can perhaps give them a bit of reassurance and not so much tell them what their rights are, but encourage them not to just to accept that because they're told that, they should accept it. They have a right to challenge treatments, which could be life-saving. Absolutely.
And so, what are their options? How much do you think they should fight to get the treatment they should deserve?
Well, the only thing I can judge that on, Lucy, is what would I do if I was in their shoes? And if somebody said you've got cancer, but we can't, provide surgery for 8 weeks, 12 weeks, fair enough. I might do a little bit of research initially, just to understand what that meant, ask the right questions, and then play merry hell about it. I would go back to the oncologist. I would then write to the trust responsible for that. I would then get in touch with the PALS, which is the Patient Liaison Service at the NHS Trust as well. I would write to my MP. I would write to the press. I would scream blue murder about it until somebody actually gave me the treatment, not that just I need, but I deserve. This isn't, a minor treatment. This is life-saving treatment. And, if it's going to save my life, then delaying decreases my odds of survival. So I would fight tooth and nail to get what I deserve.
And then just the last point, because I think it's really, really fantastic. Everything, you're brilliant. The last point is I just want to pick up on some of the things that you've seen and heard of throughout your campaign. So I know we've talked about during crisis points or pinch points in the hospitals, there were surgeons who were redeployed and people told, as they were going into theatre, I'm sorry, for cancer surgery, I'm sorry, you're going to have to, get off and go back to the ward or whatever. We need to make way for COVID. If you've got any anecdotes of people that have come in touch with you, you mentioned the twins, we'll just do a little bit of that. And then I think it's brilliant. So yeah, any things that have come to you that just stick out, things you've seen that put humans behind the statistics.
Sure. I mean, there was one lady who got in touch with me at the back end of last year. So this was before the latest lockdown. actually talking about her ex-husband, who was due to have surgery for cancer and not quite on the operating table, but not far off. It was cancelled and was told to go home. So, they challenged why, and they basically were told, well, unfortunately, there's not a hospital in the whole of the West Midlands that could currently deal with you. The reason why wasn't because of the lack of surgeons, it's because all the theatre nurses have been redeployed to work on COVID wards. So the surgeons were there, they're willing and able to do the work in terms of the surgery, but obviously they can't work in isolation. So everything was cancelled.
Was that a life-saving operation? That was a tumour. Sorry, I missed what.
Yes, it was. And I think from memory, they ended up paying for this privately. So people are going to immense expense, in order to secure treatment that will extend or save their lives. But of course, there's a very small percentage of people who are able to do that.
And you mentioned some twins that had come in touch with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is perhaps even worse. And this was, again, a lady who'd been in touch about her twin sister, who early in November last year started to develop excruciating pains. So I think she went through a period throughout November and December of trying to get in to see a GP, going to A&E, and was just continually turned away or sent home and told to take painkillers. And I think this went on for the best part of 2 months until towards the end of December, where they finally admitted her. And I think they did some tests and she was told, go home, you've just got sciatica, here's some painkillers. I think towards the end of January, she was readmitted again. Bearing in mind, I think at this point she'd lost 4 stone in weight. So she was, an extremely ill lady. At that point, she was diagnosed with a soft tissue cancer. They said, sorry, you've only got 3 to 12 months to live, but we'll start radiotherapy next week. And she died before she could even start the radiotherapy. She was 27. So there were numerous opportunities there for someone to just say, hang on, let's check, let's do, to do a proper job, let's diagnose this correctly. And every time she was turned away. I think this is also slightly endemic of younger people presenting with cancer symptoms, that too often they are told, no, it can't be cancer. Kelly had the same thing. She was misdiagnosed for 7 months. So when she finally did get a diagnosis, the cancer was already stage 4. If it had been caught earlier, the outcome could have been different. And this is one of the real frustrations we have about this campaign taking so long, is that people are dying, but we're also getting a lot of people who could have been caught earlier and cured, that now when they're being seen, the question is, I'm sorry, it's too late. We've had that information from radiographers, for example, who are finding this a terrible thing because they just keep seeing patients and they think it's too late, it's too late, it's too late. If we caught you earlier, and it's just unacceptable.
And I suppose I know some work was done by the LSE and Professor Carol Sikora. I know there are younger people that die of COVID, but on average, people who die of COVID is about the same as the average life expectancy, whereas younger patients are more likely to get cancer. So in terms of life years, we're not doing a great deal by ignoring or failing to treat that group of people.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that can be somewhat underestimated as well is, if you think, particularly for people with cancer or people who've had cancer but it's in remission, and they're not getting the routine tests, the routine screenings they should be getting in order to make sure that the cancer hasn't returned, they're going through some absolute mental torture at the moment. Every day they keep thinking, I wonder if it's come back yet, because they have no answers. So from a mental health point of view, I think this is actually quite damaging to a lot of patients as well. So I think what is being ignored here is a bubble that is getting bigger and bigger. And when it bursts, my God, the fallout will be terrible. We will have people who will be dying unnecessarily. We'll have people suffering with mental health problems. And that's not even brushing over how families will feel. from our personal experience, and losing Kelly was the worst thing imaginable. But when you also think, could that have been avoided? Then it just makes it feel so much worse as well.
What would be something you would like to do right now if you could?
Well, one thing for certain I would love to do, and I will put that up there publicly, is I would invite Matt Hancock and Simon Stevens to meet with myself and Professor Price on the Catch Up with Cancer campaign. If the government think we are not credible or our data is inaccurate, then let's sit down and discuss this. Let's debate this on live TV in front of the public, and then we can then determine from that what the correct course of action is.
Well, we'll tweet that out, and I'll tag Matt Hancock and Simon Stevens in and see what.
Good luck with that.